Hi everyone, welcome back for another video. In today's video, I'm going to be talking about default pension fund and why you might not want to leave your pension in a default pension fund. If you're new here, my name's Caroline. I am on a mission to share my knowledge to help women to manage their finances and also to help them to live a more fulfilling life. It is a wish that I have for myself as a mother of 3 children, and I hope that this video will help you in that regard. In the UK, there are so many women who live in poverty for various structural reasons, from dropping out of the workplace because they are usually the primary carer, or they are just not in industries where you achieve a high pay, or you might be a single parent, which makes it much harder to acquire wealth and accumulate wealth when you only have one person to manage the finances, and a whole host of other reasons to do with gender and sex discrimination. However, pensions are still a really important way to help you to build your financial future. So what is auto-enrollment? Well, auto-enrollment came into force around 2012, and the whole intention was to literally auto-enroll people into a pension scheme. And the objective of this was to try and help more people to save for their pensions and for the future. So typically you have to earn about 10k a year to be auto-enrolled, and you won't be able to access your pension pot until you're 55, maybe 58, maybe even later, as we get to understand exactly what the plans and priorities are of this new government. Normally your pension payments will be held by a pension company or a pension scheme, and they will manage that for you. Now, you can opt out of the auto-enrollment, and all you need to do is just tell your employer, literally just send an email to HR. Sometimes they might ask you to fill in a bit of paperwork to opt out, but essentially it's a pretty straightforward process to opt out. And normally if you're just starting a new job, you do have the option to tick on their signing on forms or their onboarding forms that you want to be opted out of auto-enrollment. If you do nothing, then you will automatically be opted in. Now, I would not recommend that you opt out of the auto-enrollment, and that is because your employer has to match a certain percentage of your pension payments. Now, the minimum amount is 5%. So 5% from you and 3% from your employer. If you choose to opt out, then you are losing out on 3% of payments towards your pension. Now, that doesn't make any sense to me. Now, I appreciate losing 5% in your mind. You're like, well, 5%, I'd rather have that money directly in my pocket. I get that. But on the flip side, you're losing out on 3% from your employer, which I know when maybe you were young, you might be thinking 3%, whatever, I don't really care. But actually, when you are heading towards retirement, and I know retirement can seem a very, very long time away. I know when I was in my 20s, when people were telling me about pensions, I was like, what are you even talking about? I don't care, I'm just trying to save for a house. That is the reality. Pensions was just such a foreign concept to me, that somebody talking to me about pensions and paying into a pension was like, why are you talking to me about this? This is not my priority at all. But I wish I had listened much earlier on and started investing in my pension. But there you have it, it's a lesson learned. The other thing to bear in mind is that when you opt out of auto-enrollment, you're also losing out on the tax relief that comes from opting out. So if you opt out, then depending on your personal tax rate, you are basically going to be paying 40% of whatever that 5% is worth to you, or you could be paying 20% depending on where your tax band falls. And I would imagine if you are an additional rate taxpayer, i.e. 45%, you're very unlikely to opt out of pensions, but you know, people do strange things. Now, when you are auto-enrolled, typically you will be auto-enrolled into what they call a default fund. Now, the benefit of this is that a fund manager or the pension company will design a default fund based on the profile of the employee base. So if you work in a company where you have slightly older people, then the default pension fund will kind of be designed to reflect certain levels of risk. So for example, if you're fairly young, you can probably afford to have your pensions more heavily invested in things like equities, i.e. those big tech funds that tend to be quite volatile, but over the long term, you will ride out the negative with much greater highs. So over the longer term, even though the graph you might be looking at is going like this, it's actually going like this and going up over time. So that's just something to bear in mind. They're also great for people who just have no knowledge nor interest in investing, and all they want is somebody else to manage it for them. 90 to 95% of people are auto-enrolled into these default funds, and that's absolutely fine for most people. The advantage, obviously, of the default fund is that typically fees are fairly low, and they tend to be actively managed. And when I say fees are low, in my old company, the fees were about 0.3%, which was actually pretty good. So the company had negotiated the fees like to a level of 0.3%, which is kind of like the kind of fees that you would expect to see if you were to invest through Vanguard, one of their lifestyle strategies, where the fees are like very low, like sub 0.5%. So very good actually. The other thing about default funds is that they tend to have a higher level of scrutiny because the scheme and the trustees have a regulatory obligation to ensure that the default fund remains appropriate for the employee profile. Now, the disadvantages of a default fund is that, as I said at the beginning, if you work in a company where you have a slightly older population, then the default fund is going to be designed to be less risky because you have more people closer to retirement, and therefore they might want to start investing in things like bonds, which are a little bit safer, so government bonds or corporate bonds. So that might not be right for you, particularly if you are a young person. If you are in your 20s or even early 30s or even mid 30s, to be fair, you might be thinking that that default fund won't deliver you high enough returns, and you may have more of a risky appetite to go and invest in funds yourself. So the default fund may not necessarily be right for you depending on how risky you want to be with where your pension is invested. Now, something to note is that if you do decide to opt out of the default fund and choose your own funds, you need to be mindful of fees. There's quite a few videos about fees and how they can eat into your return. And let's say, for example, if you're paying 1% to an advisor, then you've got, and let's say, I don't know, conservatively 5% growth on your money, then that fund manager has taken 1% fees, and then you've got inflation of about 2%. So essentially you've only actually made a gain of 2%. So just bear that in mind. Now, how do you change the default fund? Well, this is pretty straightforward actually. You can just go to your pension provider. Normally when you join a pension scheme, they will send you details of how to log in yourself so that you can view your pension. And within it, they normally will make it fairly easy for you to change your funds. And I've done that over the last 10 years and had some learnings. Now, the thing about choosing your own funds, like personally for me, is that while I chose my own funds and they did do pretty well, there were times where sometimes I would change the fund and I would forget to go and check, and it would be years later that I would go and check and see, actually, I could have done much better if I'd stayed in the default fund. But as I said, with all these things where you're choosing slightly higher, riskier funds, then know that over time, those losses will even themselves out. So at the time when I went to look, things weren't looking so great, but they still had appreciated. If you're going to manage your own funds yourself, the things you need to look out for is number one, fees. Also, think about how risky you want to be. Now, if you're closer to retirement, you probably don't want to be so risky. If you are fairly young, then maybe you can afford the risk. And maybe even if you are young and your risk appetite is actually quite low, then just stay in the default fund. The default fund sometimes gets a bad rap, but actually it's pretty good for 90% of people. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. Personally for me, I just personally like to dabble a little bit and take a few more risks. So I hope that's been helpful to those people who might be looking at default funds and thinking about whether to stay in it or not. Personally, for me, as I said, I did switch, but that doesn't always necessarily mean it's the right decision. I am not a financial advisor. As always, seek professional advice, and thank you for watching, and I will see you for the next video. Bye.